The morning fog rolled off Lake Superior like ghostly fingers, reaching into the timber town of Cedar Falls, Michigan, where secrets lingered as thick as the mist itself. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 1923, something was burning that shouldn't have been burning, and someone was screaming who shouldn't have been left alone. Martha Hayes pressed her face against the frost-covered window of the company boarding house, watching orange flames lick the sky 3 blocks away. The Whitmore textile mill was ablaze, its wooden frame crackling like kindling in the autumn wind. But what made her blood run cold wasn't the fire itself. It was the realization that 12-year-old Grace Sullivan was still inside. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Martha had seen the girl's mother, Rebecca Sullivan, collapse outside the mill gates 20 minutes earlier, her factory uniform singed and her face streaked with soot. Rebecca had been working the night shift when the fire started, but in her panic to escape, she'd forgotten that Grace sometimes snuck into the mill's basement to do her homework by the warmth of the boiler room. The girl's father had died in a logging accident 2 years prior, leaving Rebecca to work double shifts just to keep food on their table. The fire department's brass bell clanged frantically as volunteers rushed toward the inferno with their horse-drawn engine, but Martha knew they'd be too late. The mill's wooden structure was already half consumed, and the basement where Grace would be trapped was directly beneath the worst of the blaze. That's when she saw him. Marcus Bennett emerged from the smoke-filled street like something out of a frontier legend. Standing 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Marcus was the kind of man who made door frames look small and made other men step aside without thinking. His massive frame moved with surprising grace as he approached the burning building, his weathered face calm despite the chaos surrounding him. Marcus worked as the mill's head carpenter, a position that required both physical strength and meticulous attention to detail. At 35, he'd earned the respect of every worker in Cedar Falls through his fairness, his skill, and his absolute reliability. When Marcus Bennett said something would get done, it got done. When he gave his word, it was better than any written contract, but there was something else about Marcus that set him apart from other men, something that made the townspeople whisper when they thought he couldn't hear. 7 years earlier, Marcus had been caught in a mine collapse in the copper fields of Upper Michigan. The accident had left him with a pronounced limp in his left leg and scars across the right side of his face that ran from his temple to his jaw. The injuries had ended his mining career, but hadn't diminished his strength or his spirit. What troubled the good people of Cedar Falls wasn't Marcus's appearance. Frontier towns were full of men marked by dangerous work. What troubled them was his kindness toward people whom society had deemed unworthy of kindness. Marcus helped the town drunk find work when he was sober. He made sure the Widow Johnson's roof got repaired before winter, asking for no payment. He treated the half-wit boy, Tommy Patterson, with the same respect he showed the bank president. In a town where social order depended on everyone knowing their place, Marcus Bennett was dangerously egalitarian. Martha watched through her window as Marcus studied the burning mill with the methodical assessment of a man who understood structural engineering. While the volunteer firemen shouted orders and ran around with their hoses, Marcus was calculating load-bearing walls, estimating how long the building would stand, and planning a route that might, just might, lead to the basement and back. Out again. The mill's night foreman, Harold Whitmore Jr., son of the mill's owner, grabbed Marcus by the shoulder as he approached the main entrance. Even from 3 blocks away, Martha could see the heated conversation between the two men. Harold was gesticulating wildly, probably ordering Marcus to stay back, to wait for the fire department, to avoid risking his life for a girl whose family couldn't afford to compensate him for his heroism. Marcus's response was characteristically simple. He removed Harold's hand from his shoulder with gentle but irresistible force, handed the man his carpenter's tool belt, and walked into the burning building. The next 10 minutes passed like hours. Martha found herself holding her breath as smoke poured from every window and doorway of the mill. The volunteer firemen had arrived and were dousing the exterior walls with water, but everyone knew it was too late to save the building. The question now was whether Marcus would emerge alive and whether he'd bring Grace Sullivan with him. Rebecca Sullivan had been taken to Dr. Morrison's clinic to treat her burns and smoke inhalation, but Martha could see a small crowd gathering outside the mill gates. Word traveled fast in Cedar Falls, and news of Marcus's rescue attempt was spreading through the town like the fire itself. People emerged from their homes despite the early hour, drawn by the combination of disaster and potential heroism that made for the kind of story folks would tell for decades. The crowd included the usual collection of town notables. Mayor Thompson stood with his wife, both dressed hastily but still managing to look dignified. Banker Franklin Pierce observed the scene with the calculating expression of a man already thinking about insurance settlements and reconstruction loans. Several mill workers who'd escaped the fire clustered together, their faces grim with worry for their colleague and the trapped girl. But Martha's attention was drawn to a smaller group standing slightly apart from the main crowd. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the mill owner's wife, stood with 3 other women from the town's social elite, their expressions revealing more than their whispered conversations. These were the women who organized charity drives and church socials, who decided which families deserved help and which deserved judgment, and they were not pleased with Marcus Bennett's unauthorized heroics. Martha could read their disapproval, in their posture, in the way they glanced between the burning mill and the crowd of working-class families who were cheering for Marcus's safe return. To these women, Marcus was disrupting the natural order of things. Heroes were supposed to be handsome, well-born men who saved beautiful girls and received appropriate recognition for their nobility. Marcus was none of these things. A tremendous crash echoed through the morning air as part of the mill's roof collapsed, sending sparks shooting into the sky like fireworks. The crowd gasped collectively, and several women began crying. Mrs. Sullivan's sister, Mary O'Brien, fell to her knees in the muddy street, clutching her rosary and praying in a voice that carried over the noise of the fire. That's when Marcus emerged from the smoke. He appeared in the mill's side entrance like an apparition, his massive frame silhouetted against the orange glow behind him. In his arms, he carried Grace Sullivan, her small body limp but clearly breathing. Marcus's clothing was charred and smoking, his face was streaked with soot, and his movements showed the exhaustion of a man who'd pushed his physical limits beyond all reasonable boundaries. The crowd erupted in cheers as Marcus carried Grace toward Dr. Morrison's clinic. Working men shouted his name with genuine admiration. Children pointed in awe at the giant who'd walked through fire to save someone else's child. Even the volunteer firemen, embarrassed by their own inability to attempt a rescue, applauded Marcus's courage and success. But Martha noticed something that chilled her more than the morning wind. As Marcus passed through the crowd, she saw the expressions on certain faces, not just Mrs. Whitmore and her social circle, but several other townspeople, whose approval Marcus had never sought and would never receive. They weren't celebrating his heroism. They were calculating its cost. Cedar Falls was a company town, which meant that social stability depended on everyone accepting their assigned roles in the economic hierarchy. Mill owners made decisions, mill workers followed orders, and everyone else found their place somewhere in between. Marcus Bennett's rescue of Grace Sullivan was certainly admirable, but it was also disruptive. Who was he to risk the mill owner's property by entering a burning building without permission? Who was he to make the fire department look incompetent by succeeding where they'd failed? Who was he to claim the kind of heroic recognition that should be reserved for men of better breeding and social standing? Martha understood what was happening because she'd seen it before. Cedar Falls had a way of punishing people who stepped too far outside their expected roles, regardless of their intentions or their results. The punishment wasn't immediate or obvious. It came in the form of whispered conversations, social isolation, economic pressure, and the gradual erosion of a person's place in the community. Marcus Bennett had just painted a target on his back, and he probably didn't even realize it. As the crowd began to disperse and the fire department continued their futile efforts to save what remained of the mill, Martha made a decision that would change her life in ways she couldn't imagine. She gathered her shawl around her shoulders, left the boarding house, and walked through the smoky streets toward Dr. Morrison's clinic. She wasn't sure what she intended to do or say, but she knew that Marcus Bennett deserved to have at least one person in Cedar Falls who understood what his heroism might cost him, and perhaps more importantly, she suspected that his story was just beginning. The morning sun was rising over Lake Superior, burning through the smoke and mist to reveal a town that would never be quite the same. The Whitmore textile mill was destroyed. Grace Sullivan was alive, and Marcus Bennett had established himself as either a hero or a problem, depending on who was doing the judging. What none of them knew, not Martha, not Marcus, not the disapproving social elite of Cedar Falls, was that the real fire was still to come. And when it arrived, it would leave scars that no amount of heroism could heal, and reveal truths about courage, beauty, and human nature that would challenge everything the town thought it understood about worth and dignity. The rescue was over, but the story was just beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 weeks after the mill fire, Martha Hayes discovered that heroism in Cedar Falls came with a price tag that few men could afford to pay. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation or public announcement, but through the quiet accumulation of small cruelties that characterized how the town's power structure dealt with inconvenient individuals. Martha first noticed it during her weekly visit to Morrison's general store, where she overheard Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore discussing Marcus Bennett's employment prospects with the store owner's wife. "Of course, we appreciate Mr. Bennett's enthusiasm during the fire," Mrs. Whitmore was saying, her voice carrying the particular tone wealthy women used when discussing the help. "But one must consider the broader implications. A man who disregards authority, who takes unnecessary risks with company property, who assumes responsibilities beyond his station. Such behavior sets a dangerous precedent for other workers." Martha pretended to examine bolts of fabric while listening to the conversation that would reshape her understanding of Cedar Falls's social machinery. Mrs. Whitmore continued her character assassination with the surgical precision of someone who'd perfected the art of destroying reputations while maintaining plausible deniability. "My husband has been quite generous in his patience with Mr. Bennett's irregularities," she explained to her captive audience. "The man's tendency to interfere in matters that don't concern him, his inappropriate familiarity with families above, his social standing, his general disregard for proper boundaries. The fire incident was simply the final straw." What Mrs. Whitmore didn't mention, but what Martha gradually pieced together through conversations with other mill workers, was that Marcus Bennett had been asking uncomfortable questions about the mill's safety procedures in the weeks leading up to the fire. As head carpenter, Marcus had noticed several violations of basic fire prevention protocols, inadequate emergency exits, blocked stairwells used for storage, and faulty electrical work that should have been repaired months earlier. Marcus had submitted written reports to Harold Whitmore, Jr., the mill's day-to-day manager, documenting these safety hazards and recommending immediate corrective action. The reports had been acknowledged but ignored, filed away with the kind of bureaucratic dismissal that powerful men use to handle inconvenient truths from subordinates. The mill fire that had made Marcus a hero had also vindicated his warnings, in ways that made the Whitmore family deeply uncomfortable. An investigation by state authorities would likely reveal the safety violations Marcus had documented, potentially resulting in fines, legal liability, and public embarrassment for one of Cedar Falls' most prominent families. The solution was elegantly simple: discredit the messenger before his message gained wider attention. Martha's investigation into the campaign against Marcus began accidentally when she witnessed a conversation between banker Franklin Pierce and mill supervisor Charles Morton outside the First National Bank. She'd been walking to her job at the town library when she heard Marcus's name mentioned. In tones that made her pause behind the bank's brick corner, "Bennett's become a liability," Pierce was explaining to Morton. "His heroics have attracted attention from state labor inspectors who are asking questions about mill safety procedures. Mrs. Whitmore is concerned that his continued employment might complicate the insurance settlement." Morton nodded with the understanding of a man who'd navigated company politics long enough to recognize when someone's fate had been decided. "What do you suggest?" Pierce's response revealed the sophisticated machinery of economic pressure that kept Cedar Falls' social order intact. "Nothing dramatic. Just make it clear to the other mill supervisors that Bennett's judgment has become questionable. Raise concerns about his reliability, his tendency to exceed his authority, his disruptive influence on other workers. Create enough doubt about his competence that his dismissal becomes inevitable." Martha felt her stomach tighten as she realized the scope of what she was witnessing. This wasn't simple workplace politics or personality conflicts. This was a coordinated effort to destroy a good man's livelihood because his integrity had become inconvenient for powerful people who valued their reputation more than worker safety. The campaign against Marcus unfolded with the methodical efficiency that characterized all of the town's unofficial business. Workers who had previously sought Marcus's advice on construction projects were suddenly assigned to different supervisors. His recommendations for mill repairs were consistently overruled in favor of cheaper, less effective alternatives. His requests for materials and equipment experienced unexplained delays that made his work schedules impossible to maintain. Most damaging of all was the gradual erosion of his relationships with other workers. Men who had respected Marcus's expertise and fairness found themselves receiving subtle but unmistakable messages that association with him might jeopardize their own employment. In the town, where the mill provided virtually all the decent-paying jobs, few workers could afford to be seen as allies of someone who'd fallen from management's favor. Martha watched this destruction unfold from her position at the town library, where her job processing property records and business documents gave her insight into Cedar Falls' economic machinery. She began noticing patterns that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy against Marcus. His credit application for materials to repair Mrs. Patterson's roof was mysteriously denied by the bank, despite his excellent payment history. His name was quietly removed from the list of approved contractors for town maintenance projects. Local businesses that had previously welcomed his patronage began treating him with the cool politeness reserved for customers whose money was acceptable, but whose presence was not. The psychological impact on Marcus was subtle but unmistakable. Martha observed him during his visits to the library, where he researched construction techniques and safety procedures with the dedication of a man who took professional pride in his work. She saw how his natural confidence was gradually being eroded by the constant pressure of knowing that his every action was being scrutinized for evidence of the troublemaking tendencies his enemies claimed to see. But what troubled Martha most was Marcus's growing isolation from the community he'd served faithfully for years. The man who had once been invited to every barn-raising and community celebration now found himself excluded from social gatherings, through the simple expedient of having his invitations mysteriously lost or delayed until after events had passed. The turning point came when Martha discovered the true scope of the mill's safety violations through her access to county building records. As the town librarian, she had reason to research property assessments and construction permits, and her investigation revealed that the Whitmore Mill had been operating in violation of state building codes for over 3 years. The violations weren't minor technical issues, but serious safety hazards that directly contributed to the severity of the fire that had nearly killed Grace Sullivan. Emergency exits had been blocked or eliminated to maximize floor space for machinery. Fire suppression equipment had been removed or disabled to reduce maintenance costs. Electrical systems had been modified by unqualified workers to accommodate additional equipment without proper safety upgrades. Most shocking of all, Martha discovered that Marcus's safety reports had been copied and sent to state authorities by someone within the mill's management structure. The anonymous whistleblower had provided detailed documentation of the safety violations, along with evidence that management had been aware of the hazards, but had chosen to ignore them for economic reasons. The state investigation that was now threatening the Whitmore family's financial and legal position had been triggered not by Marcus's heroics during the fire, but by his meticulous documentation of safety violations and someone else's decision to expose the mill's criminal negligence. To appropriate authorities, Marcus Bennett wasn't being destroyed because he was a troublemaker. He was being destroyed because he was an honest man whose integrity had made him a threat to people who valued profit more than human life. Martha's discovery of these facts coincided with a devastating escalation in the campaign against Marcus. Harold Whitmore Jr. announced that budget constraints necessitated eliminating the head carpenter position, effective immediately. Marcus would be offered a position as a general laborer at significantly reduced wages, or he could seek employment elsewhere. The message was clear: accept humiliation and economic hardship, or leave Cedar Falls entirely. But Martha had also discovered something else through her research, something that suggested Marcus's enemies had made a crucial miscalculation. The anonymous whistleblower who'd contacted state authorities wasn't a member of mill management, as everyone assumed. The writing style and technical knowledge revealed in the complaint letters matched the safety reports Marcus had submitted to mill supervisors. Marcus Bennett hadn't just documented safety violations. He'd secretly reported them to state authorities when his official reports were ignored. The hero who'd walked through fire to save Grace Sullivan had also been quietly working through legal channels to prevent future fires from endangering other workers and their families. The campaign to destroy Marcus was being orchestrated by people who didn't realize they were attacking the very man whose whistleblowing had triggered the investigation they were trying to avoid. Their efforts to discredit him would only draw more attention to his credibility and his documented concerns about mill safety. Martha faced a choice that would define not just her relationship with Marcus Bennett, but her understanding of her own moral courage. She could remain a passive observer, safely documenting the destruction of a good man while avoiding any personal risk. Or she could act on her knowledge, knowing that defending Marcus would likely make her a target of the same forces that were systematically destroying his life. Standing in the town library, surrounded by records that documented both Marcus's integrity and his enemies' corruption, Martha realized that her discovery had revealed something larger than a simple conflict between a worker and management. She'd uncovered evidence of systematic corruption that extended far beyond the mill, involving the bank, local government, and the social elite who controlled Cedar Falls' economic and political machinery. The question now was whether one librarian and one carpenter could stand against an entire system built on the principle that truth was negotiable when it threatened the interests of powerful people. Marcus Bennett's heroism during the mill fire had been just the beginning of his troubles. But Martha Hayes was beginning to understand that his real battle wasn't against flames or falling timbers. It was against the kind of organized evil that hid behind respectability and destroyed good people through the simple expedient of making their honesty too expensive to maintain. The discovery phase of their story was complete. Now came the test of whether they would find the courage to act on what they'd learned. The confrontation that would define Marcus Bennett's fate began not in the mill or the town square, but in the cramped office of Cedar Falls' weekly newspaper, where truth and power prepared for their inevitable collision. Martha Hayes arrived at the Cedar Falls Tribune office on a grey October morning, carrying a leather satchel filled with documents that could either save Marcus Bennett's reputation or destroy her own. The newspaper's editor, Samuel Morrison, no relation to the town doctor, was a rail-thin man in his 50s who'd built his career on the careful balance between informing the public and avoiding conflicts with the advertisers who kept his in-paper solvent. Miss Hayes, Morrison greeted her with the wary politeness of a man who recognized trouble when it walked through his door. "What brings you to the Tribune this morning?" Martha placed her satchel on his desk with deliberate care. "Mr. Morrison, I have information about the mill fire that I believe the public deserves to know. Safety violations, ignored warnings, and a coordinated effort to silence the man who tried to prevent this tragedy." Morrison's expression shifted from wariness to genuine alarm. The Cedar Falls Tribune survived because it reported on church socials, harvest festivals, and business success stories while carefully avoiding the kind of investigative journalism that might anger powerful families. What Martha was proposing represented exactly the sort of story that could put his newspaper out of business. "Miss Hayes," Morrison said carefully, "I appreciate your civic concern, but you must understand that serious accusations require serious evidence. The Whitmore family has been pillars of this community for 3 generations. Any suggestion of wrongdoing on their part would need to be supported by ironclad proof." Martha opened her satchel and began arranging documents across Morrison's desk with the methodical precision of a librarian organizing a research collection, building permits that had been falsified, safety inspection reports that had been altered, correspondence between mill management and state authorities that revealed a pattern of deliberate deception spanning multiple years. "This is ironclad proof, Mr. Morrison," Martha said quietly. "Marcus Bennett didn't just risk his life to save Grace Sullivan. He spent months documenting safety violations and reporting them through proper channels. The mill fire happened because the Whitmore family chose profit over worker safety, and now they're destroying Mr. Bennett's reputation to prevent these facts from becoming public." Morrison studied the documents with the growing expression of a man who realized he was looking at the biggest story of his career and the potential end of his newspaper. The evidence Martha had assembled was comprehensive and damning, revealing not just the specific safety violations that had contributed to the mill fire, but a broader pattern of corruption involving local banks, government officials, and business leaders. "Where did you obtain these documents?" Morrison asked, his journalistic instincts warring with his survival instincts. "Through legitimate research at the county records office and the state labor department," Martha replied. "Everything here is public record, Mr. Morrison. The only reason this information hasn't been reported is because no one has taken the time to connect the pieces." Morrison continued examining the evidence while Martha watched his internal struggle play out across his features. She understood the position she was putting him in. Publishing her story would almost certainly result in retaliation from the town's power structure, potentially including the loss of advertising revenue that kept the Tribune operating. But failing to publish the story would make him complicit in the destruction of an innocent man and the cover-up of criminal negligence that had nearly cost a child her life. "Miss Hayes," Morrison said finally, "even if everything you've documented is accurate, publishing this story could destroy more than just the Whitmore family's reputation. It could damage the entire economic foundation of Cedar Falls. The mill employs half the town. If state authorities shut it down for safety violations, hundreds of families would lose their livelihoods." Martha had anticipated this argument. The utilitarian calculation that often protected corruption in small communities where economic survival depended on a few major employers. Her response revealed the depth of thought she'd given to the moral complexity of her decision. "Mr. Morrison, the mill will eventually be forced to comply with safety regulations whether we publish this story or not. State investigators are already examining the facility because of the anonymous reports Mr. Bennett filed. The only question is whether the truth comes out through honest journalism or through government enforcement actions that will be far more damaging to the community." Her logic was compelling, but Morrison's hesitation revealed the additional pressures he faced as a small-town newspaper editor. The Whitmore family didn't just own the mill, they held mortgages on several downtown properties, served on the bank's board of directors, and had family connections throughout the regions. Business and political networks. "I need to consider this carefully," Morrison said, gathering the documents into a neat stack. "May I keep these materials for review?" "Of course," Martha replied, "but Mr. Morrison, I should mention that I've prepared copies of everything for the State Labor Commission and the Federal Workplace Safety Bureau. If the Tribune chooses not to publish this story, it will still become public knowledge through other channels." Morrison looked up sharply, recognizing the implications of her statement. Martha wasn't just offering him an exclusive story. She was informing him that the story would break regardless of his decision. His choice was whether the Tribune would lead the coverage or be forced to follow other outlets. "You're forcing my hand, Miss Hayes," Morrison observed. "No, Mr. Morrison," Martha corrected. "I'm offering you the opportunity to do what newspapers are supposed to do, inform the public about matters of legitimate concern. What happens next is entirely your decision." While Martha was presenting her case to the newspaper editor, Marcus Bennett was facing his own moment of truth at the mill. Harold Whitmore, Jr. had summoned him to the administrative office for what was being described as a routine performance review. But Marcus understood that his employment was about to be terminated under circumstances designed to discredit his character and justify his dismissal. The mill's temporary office, established in a converted warehouse while the main building was being rebuilt, buzzed with the controlled chaos of a business trying to resume operations after a devastating fire. Workers moved between hastily erected workstations, while supervisors coordinated the complex logistics of maintaining production with damaged equipment and reduced capacity. Marcus arrived at the appointed time, carrying a folder containing his own documentation of the events leading up to the fire. He'd spent the previous evening organizing his safety reports, correspondence with management, and copies of the anonymous complaints he'd filed with state authorities. If Harold Whitmore wanted to make their confrontation official, Marcus was prepared to ensure that all relevant facts became part of the record. "Mr. Bennett," Harold greeted him with the false cordiality of a man about to deliver bad news while pretending it was for the recipient's own good. "Please, have a seat. I wanted to discuss your future with the company." Marcus remained standing, his imposing height giving him a psychological advantage that Harold clearly found unsettling. "I prefer to stand, Mr. Whitmore. What did you want to discuss?" Harold's prepared speech about budget constraints and organizational restructuring faltered in the face of Marcus's direct gaze and uncompromising posture. Instead of the apologetic explanation he'd planned to deliver, Harold found himself confronting a man who clearly understood exactly what was happening and why. "Very well," Harold said, abandoning his diplomatic approach. "The truth is, Mr. Bennett, that your actions during and after the fire have raised serious questions about your judgment and your loyalty to this company. Walking into a burning building without authorization, making unauthorized statements to state investigators, creating unnecessary concerns among the workforce, these behaviors suggest that you've forgotten your place in this organization." Marcus opened his folder and placed a document on Harold's desk with deliberate precision. "Mr. Whitmore, this is a copy of the safety report I submitted to your office 6 weeks before the fire. It specifically identifies the blocked emergency exits, the faulty electrical work, and the inadequate fire suppression systems that contributed to the severity of the incident." Harold glanced at the document without picking it up, his expression revealing that he remembered the report and his decision to ignore its recommendations. "Mr. Bennett, maintenance issues are complex matters that require balancing multiple priorities. Your suggestions were noted and considered." "Considered and rejected," Marcus corrected, placing another document on the desk. "This is a copy of my second report, submitted 4 weeks before the fire, requesting immediate action on the same safety violations. And this," he added, producing a third document, "is a copy of my third report, submitted 2 weeks before the fire, warning that continued delays could result in serious injury or death." Harold's composure cracked as he realized that Marcus had maintained detailed records of their interactions, creating a paper trail that documented management's deliberate indifference to worker safety. The conversation was no longer about terminating a troublesome employee. It had become a confrontation between a man with evidence of criminal negligence and the executive responsible for that negligence. "Mr. Bennett," Harold said, his voice taking on a threatening edge, "I hope you understand the serious consequences of making unfounded accusations against this company and its management. Defamation is a serious crime, and we have legal resources to protect our reputation against dishonest employees." Marcus placed his final document on Harold's desk, a carbon copy of the complaint he'd filed with state labor authorities, complete with the official receipt stamp and case number. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm not making accusations. I'm stating facts that are already part of an official investigation. State inspectors will be arriving next week to examine the mill's safety procedures and interview employees about management's response to safety concerns." The revelation that Marcus had been the anonymous whistleblower whose complaints had triggered the state investigation transformed the dynamic of their confrontation completely. Harold had planned to terminate a troublesome employee. Instead, he found himself facing the primary witness in a criminal investigation that could result in massive fines, legal liability, and potential prison sentences for company executives. "You son of a bitch," Harold whispered, his careful facade finally cracking to reveal the rage and fear beneath. "You've been working against this company, against the families who depend on it for their livelihoods. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Marcus's response carried the quiet authority of a man who'd carefully considered the moral implications of his actions. "Mr. Whitmore, I've done exactly what any decent man should do when he sees innocent people being placed in danger by the negligence of those responsible for their safety. Your family's reputation is less important than Grace Sullivan's life or the lives of any other workers who might have died in a fire that proper safety procedures could have prevented." The confrontation escalated quickly from there, with Harold making increasingly desperate threats about Marcus's future employment prospects, his credit rating, and his social standing in Cedar Falls. But Marcus had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. He'd committed himself to telling the truth, regardless of the personal consequences. The meeting ended with Harold's formal announcement that Marcus's employment was terminated immediately for insubordination, unreliability, and conduct detrimental to company interests. Marcus would be escorted from the premises and banned from returning to mill property. But as Marcus gathered his tools and personal belongings under the watchful eyes of security guards, he carried with him the knowledge that his stand against corruption had already succeeded in ways that his enemies couldn't prevent. The state investigation would proceed with or without his employment at the mill. The truth about safety violations would become public knowledge, regardless of Harold Whitmore's threats. Most importantly, Marcus had proven to himself that he possessed the moral courage to do what was right, even when it cost him everything he'd worked to build in Cedar Falls. The first stand had been taken, and there was no going back. The battle lines were drawn, and both sides understood that the conflict ahead would determine not just Marcus Bennett's fate, but the future of accountability and justice in a town where powerful people had grown accustomed to operating without consequences for their actions. The real war was about to begin. The retaliation began at dawn on November 15th, 1923, when Marcus Bennett discovered that someone had burned down his workshop during the night. The small building behind his rented house had contained not just his personal tools and woodworking equipment, but also the detailed safety documentation he'd been preparing for the state investigators. 15 years of accumulated craftsmanship tools, carefully maintained and lovingly used, had been reduced to charred timber and twisted metal. More devastating was the loss of the comprehensive evidence files he'd assembled to support his testimony. About mill safety violations, Marcus stood in the smoking ruins of his livelihood, understanding with crystal clarity that this was not random vandalism, but the opening move in a campaign designed to destroy every aspect of his life in Cedar Falls. The message was unmistakable. Abandon your accusations against the Whitmore family, or watch everything you've built systematically eliminated. Sheriff William Garrett arrived an hour after Marcus discovered the fire, bringing with him the kind of perfunctory investigation that confirmed rather than challenged the town's power structure. Garrett walked through the debris field with the theatrical attention of a man performing for an audience, while ensuring he found no evidence that might complicate the lives of important people. "Looks like an electrical fire," Garrett announced. After his brief examination, "These old buildings, you know how it is. Faulty wiring, accumulated sawdust, just a matter of time before something like this happened." Marcus pointed to the clear evidence of accelerant burns around the building's perimeter, the deliberately broken windows that had provided oxygen to feed the flames, and the fact that his electrical service had been disconnected for 2 days, while he waited for parts to repair a damaged junction box. None of these facts made their way into Sheriff Garrett's official report. "I understand you've been having some difficulties at the mill," Garrett continued, his tone suggesting that Marcus's employment problems somehow explained the convenient timing of the fire. Sometimes when a man's under stress, facing financial hardship, he might make decisions that seem reasonable at the time, but cause problems later. The implication was clear. Marcus had burned down his own workshop, probably for insurance money, and should be grateful that no charges were being filed. The investigation was closed before it had properly begun, leaving Marcus with no legal recourse and a growing understanding of how completely the town's institutions had been compromised. But the destruction of his workshop was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, Marcus watched his entire support network systematically dismantled through the application of economic and social pressure that revealed the sophisticated machinery of small-town corruption. His landlord, Mrs. Catherine Murphy, arrived at his door 3 days after the fire with an eviction notice based on newly discovered lease violations that had never been mentioned during his 2 years of exemplary tenancy. The violations were technical, creative, and designed to provide legal cover for what was essentially economic retaliation. "I'm sorry, Marcus," Mrs. Murphy said, her genuine distress evident in her voice. "You've been a good tenant, but I've been told that continuing to rent to you might affect my husband's employment at the grain elevator. We can't afford to take that risk." Marcus understood that Mrs. Murphy was as much a victim as he was, caught between her personal integrity and the economic threats that controlled every aspect of life in Cedar Falls. The grain elevator where her husband worked was owned by companies with financial ties to the Whitmore family, creating a web of economic dependency that made resistance costly for anyone without independent wealth. The pattern repeated throughout the town as Marcus attempted to secure new housing, temporary employment, and basic services. Landlords discovered sudden concerns about his references. Employers found reasons to avoid hiring someone with his particular qualifications. Even the local grocery store began treating him with the cold politeness reserved for customers whose money was acceptable but whose presence was unwelcome. Martha Hayes watched this systematic destruction unfold with growing horror and admiration. Horror at the ruthless efficiency with which the town's power structure could destroy an individual's life, and admiration for Marcus's refusal to surrender despite the mounting costs of his integrity. Her own situation deteriorated rapidly after Samuel Morrison published her exposé about mill safety violations in the Cedar Falls Tribune. The article, headlined "Local Hero Warned of Mill Dangers Months Before Fatal Fire," presented her documented evidence with the careful objectivity of quality journalism. But objectivity provided no protection against the retaliation that followed. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore led the counterattack with the precision of a military campaign. Within hours of the newspaper's publication, Martha received a visit from the head of the library board, announcing an emergency review of her employment based on concerns about her professional judgment and her unauthorized use of library resources. For personal projects, the library board meeting that would determine Martha's fate was scheduled for the following evening, but the outcome was predetermined through conversations that took place in private offices and drawing rooms, where the town's elite gathered to protect their interests. Martha's access to public records had made her dangerous, and her willingness to use that access on behalf of someone like Marcus Bennett had made her expendable. "Miss Hayes," explained Board Chairman Robert Sterling, a local attorney whose law practice depended heavily on Whitmore family business, "we've received serious complaints about your conduct as town librarian, using your position to gather information for personal vendettas, making unauthorized copies of official documents, engaging in activities that bring disrepute to this institution. Such behavior cannot be tolerated." Martha's defense was comprehensive and compelling. Every document she'd accessed was part of the public record. Every copy she'd made was within her authority as librarian. Every action she'd taken was motivated by legitimate public interest in workplace safety and government accountability. But the library board was not interested in facts or legal technicalities. They were interested in protecting the social order that ensured their own continued prosperity and influence. Martha's employment was terminated immediately, her access to library resources revoked, and her reputation systematically destroyed through whispered campaigns about her reliability and judgment. The economic pressure on both Martha and Marcus intensified as their remaining allies in the community were forced to choose between personal loyalty and economic survival. Friends stopped acknowledging them on the street. Businesses found reasons to refuse their patronage. Churches discovered that their presence made other parishioners uncomfortable. Marcus's attempts to find work outside Cedar Falls met with similar obstacles as word of his troublemaking spread through the region's industrial network. The Whitmore family's influence extended far beyond the town's borders, reaching into the lumber camps, mining operations, and manufacturing facilities where Marcus's skills might have found employment. Phone calls were made, letters were written, and Marcus Bennett's reputation was systematically poisoned throughout northern Michigan. He was described as unreliable, insubordinate, prone to making false accusations against his employers, and generally unsuitable for any position requiring trust or responsibility. The psychological toll of this systematic isolation began to affect both Martha and Marcus in ways that their enemies had carefully calculated. The human spirit, no matter how strong, requires community and purpose to maintain hope. When both are systematically eliminated, even the most resilient individuals begin to question their own judgment and wonder if surrender might be preferable to continued resistance. Martha found herself increasingly isolated in her boarding house room, surviving on rapidly dwindling savings while watching her professional reputation destroyed by people who had never questioned her competence until she threatened their interests. The work that had given her life meaning and structure was gone, replaced by the daily humiliation of being treated as a pariah in the community she'd served faithfully for 8 years. Marcus faced even greater challenges as his physical needs for shelter, food, and basic security became increasingly difficult to meet. The destruction of his workshop had eliminated not just his income, but his identity as a craftsman, forcing him to accept whatever menial labor he could find while living in conditions that reflected his fallen status. But the cruelest aspect of their punishment was the deliberate isolation from each other that their enemies had engineered. Martha and Marcus had never been close friends, but their shared commitment to truth and justice had created a natural alliance that might have provided mutual support during their ordeal. The town's social machinery prevented this alliance from developing by ensuring that any association between them would bring additional retaliation. Martha was warned that being seen with Marcus would confirm suspicions about her judgment and motivations. Marcus was told that involving Martha further in his problems would only make her situation worse. By Christmas of 1923, both had been reduced to shadows of their former selves, surviving on charity and struggling to maintain hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable opposition. The state investigation into mill safety had proceeded as Marcus had predicted, resulting in fines and mandated improvements. But these official vindications provided little comfort to people whose lives had been systematically destroyed. The Whitmore family had achieved their primary objective. They had demonstrated to the entire community what happened to people who challenged their authority. Marcus Bennett and Martha Hayes had become object lessons in the price of integrity, living reminders that some truths were too expensive for ordinary people to afford, but their enemies had made one crucial miscalculation. In their eagerness to destroy two individuals who had threatened their interests, they had created martyrs whose suffering would inspire others to question the justice of a system that punished honesty while rewarding corruption. The fall was complete, but the story was far from over. In their darkest hour, when hope seemed impossible and surrender appeared inevitable, Martha Hayes and Marcus Bennett were about to discover that sometimes the most profound victories emerge from the ashes of apparent defeat. The winter of 1923 would test their spirits in ways that mill fires and economic pressure could never accomplish. But it would also reveal resources of courage and compassion that neither had known they possessed, setting the stage for a resurrection that would transform not just their own lives, but the fundamental character of Cedar Falls itself. The fall had stripped away everything they thought they needed to survive. Now they would discover what they actually needed to live with dignity and purpose, and how sometimes the greatest strength emerges when people have nothing left to lose. The blizzard that struck Cedar Falls on January 12, 1924, would later be remembered as the storm that changed everything, though not for the reasons anyone expected. Martha Hayes was walking back to her boarding house from the soup kitchen run by Father O'Malley at St. Catherine's Church when the wind shifted and the snow began falling in thick, blinding sheets. Within minutes, the familiar streets of Cedar Falls disappeared beneath a white curtain that transformed the town into an alien landscape where direction and distance became impossible to judge. Martha had been surviving the winter through a combination of charity meals, odd jobs that paid in food rather than money, and the stubborn determination that had sustained her through months of systematic persecution. Her former colleagues at the library crossed streets to avoid acknowledging her presence, but Father O'Malley had refused to be intimidated by the town's social pressure, maintaining that Christian charity transcended the political calculations that governed other institutions. The soup kitchen served anyone who needed food without questions or conditions that might compromise the dignity of those forced to accept help. For Martha, these daily meals had become more than mere sustenance. They represented the last connection to a community that had otherwise abandoned her completely. But as the blizzard intensified and visibility dropped to mere feet, Martha realized she had made a potentially fatal error in judgment. The boarding house was only 6 blocks from the church, a distance she could normally cover in 15 minutes, but the swirling snow had disoriented her completely. Every building looked the same. Every street corner disappeared into white chaos, and the bitter wind cut through her inadequate coat like knives. Martha stumbled through the deepening snow for what felt like hours, her feet growing numb despite her worn boots, her hands losing feeling even inside her threadbare gloves. The temperature was dropping rapidly as the storm intensified, and she began to understand that she might die in the streets of the town that had rejected her. Another casualty of the war between truth and power that had already cost her everything. She'd work to build. That's when she collided with something solid and warm that turned out to be Marcus Bennett, struggling through the same blinding storm with the same desperate need for shelter. Marcus had been living in a converted chicken coop behind the Peterson farm, 3 miles outside town, since losing his rental house in November. The arrangement provided minimal shelter in exchange for occasional handyman work, but it required a daily walk to town for supplies and the temporary labor that barely kept him alive. He'd been caught in the storm while returning from a half-day of snow removal work that had paid him enough for bread and coffee. Miss Hayes. Marcus's voice carried through the howling wind with a combination of surprise and concern. Even in the storm's chaos, his protective instincts responded to finding someone in greater danger than himself. "Mr. Bennett," Martha gasped, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I can't find my way back to the boarding house. Everything looks the same." Marcus studied their surroundings with the systematic approach he brought to all problems, using his superior height and familiarity with the town's layout to identify landmarks that might guide them to safety. But the storm had transformed Cedar Falls into a featureless maze, where even his knowledge of every street and building provided little advantage. "The boarding house is too far in this weather," Marcus concluded. "We need immediate shelter, somewhere, closer." His suggestion led them to the one place in Cedar Falls where their presence might be tolerated regardless of their social status. The basement of the Methodist Church, which served as an unofficial refuge for transients and anyone else caught without shelter during severe weather. Reverend Thomas Carter had established the policy years earlier, maintaining that Christian charity required providing emergency shelter without regard to the worthiness or social standing of those in need. The church basement was Spartan, but warm, heated by a coal furnace that Father Carter maintained throughout the winter specifically for situations like this. Martha and Marcus found themselves sharing the space with 3 other refugees from the storm: a traveling salesman whose automobile had broken down outside town, an elderly man whose boarding house had lost heat due to frozen pipes, and a woman with 2 small children who'd been evicted from their apartment the previous day. The enforced intimacy of their shelter created an environment where the social barriers that had kept Martha and Marcus apart finally broke down. For the first time since their separate wars against the Whitmore family had begun, they were able to speak honestly about their experiences, their fears, and their growing understanding of the forces that had destroyed their lives. "I keep thinking, I should have handled things differently," Martha confided as they sat beside the furnace, sharing the warmth and the food that other refugees had contributed to their common survival. "Maybe if I'd been more diplomatic, found a way to expose the safety violations without directly challenging the Whitmore family's authority." Marcus considered her words while watching the children sleep peacefully despite their family's desperate circumstances. "Miss Hayes, diplomacy only works when both sides are operating in good faith. The Whitmore family wasn't interested in addressing safety violations. They were interested in protecting their profits. Any approach that threatened those profits would have resulted in the same retaliation we've experienced." Their conversation continued through the night as the storm raged outside, creating a space of honesty and mutual understanding that had been impossible while they were struggling separately against the same enemies. Martha learned about Marcus's background in mining, his previous experiences with corporate corruption, and his decision to settle in Cedar Falls because he'd believed small communities offered better opportunities for honest work and fair treatment. Marcus discovered Martha's intellectual curiosity, her deep knowledge of literature and history, and her sophisticated understanding of the social and economic forces that shaped small-town politics. Her work as librarian had given her insights into the connections between local families, business interests, and political power that explained how the Whitmore family had been able to coordinate such effective retaliation against their critics. But their most important discovery was the growing recognition that their individual fights against corruption had been weakened by their isolation from each other. The town's power structure had succeeded in destroying them separately by preventing them from combining their different strengths and resources into a more formidable opposition. "They've been playing divide and conquer," Martha observed as dawn approached and the storm began to subside, keep us isolated, make us feel like we're facing impossible odds alone, convince us that resistance is futile because no one else will stand with us. Marcus nodded, understanding the strategic implications of her analysis. "But if we work together, pool our knowledge and resources, we might be able to accomplish things that neither of us could manage alone." The alliance that formed in the church basement that night was built on shared suffering, mutual respect, and the recognition that their enemies had inadvertently created the conditions for a more effective resistance. Martha's research skills and institutional knowledge complemented Marcus's practical experience and moral authority as someone who'd risked his life to save others. More importantly, their partnership represented something that the Whitmore family and their allies hadn't anticipated: the possibility that their victims might refuse to remain victims, might transform their suffering into strength, and might find ways to hold powerful people accountable for their actions. The storm had stripped away the last vestiges of their former lives, leaving them with nothing to lose and everything to gain by fighting back against the forces that had destroyed them. But it had also revealed resources they hadn't known they possessed, the capacity for mutual support, the power of combined knowledge and experience, and the moral authority that came from having suffered for the sake of truth and justice. When the storm finally passed, and they emerged from the church basement into a world transformed by snow and ice, Martha and Marcus carried with them a new understanding of their situation and their possibilities. They were no longer isolated individuals, struggling alone against impossible odds. They had become allies in a cause that transcended their personal grievances, united by their commitment to protecting others from the kind of systematic abuse they had endured. The rescue had been mutual. They had saved each other from more than just the physical dangers of the blizzard. They had rescued each other from the despair and isolation that their enemies had used as weapons to break their spirits and end their resistance. Father Carter found them the next morning, sharing coffee and planning their next moves with the quiet intensity of people who had rediscovered hope. He observed their interaction with the satisfaction of a man who understood that sometimes the most important miracles happened when people found the strength to help each other, rather than waiting for divine intervention. "You two look like you're plotting something," Father Carter observed with a slight smile. "We're planning to finish what we started," Martha replied. "But this time, we're doing it together." The priest nodded approvingly. In his years of ministering to a community where power and wealth often corrupted the application of justice, he'd learned to recognize the difference between revenge and righteousness. What he saw in Martha Hayes and Marcus Bennett wasn't the bitter anger of people seeking personal retaliation, but the determined resolve of individuals committed to protecting others from the abuses they had experienced. "Be careful, Father," Carter advised. "The people you're opposing have demonstrated their willingness to destroy anyone who threatens their interests. Make sure you're prepared for whatever they might do to stop you." "Father," Marcus replied, "they've already done everything they can do to us. We've lost our jobs, our homes, our reputations, our place in this community. The only thing we have left is our integrity. And that's the one thing they can't take away unless we surrender it voluntarily." Martha added her own perspective on their transformed situation. "We understand now that our individual efforts failed because we were trying to work within a system that was designed to protect the very people we were trying to hold accountable. This time, we're going to work outside that system, appeal to authorities who can't be influenced by local politics and social pressure." The alliance forged in the storm would prove to be the turning point in their long struggle against corruption and abuse of power. But they also understood that their new partnership would make them even greater targets for retaliation. The Whitmore family and their allies had successfully destroyed Martha Hayes, the librarian, and Marcus Bennett, the mill worker. Now they would face Martha and Marcus, the team, armed with combined knowledge, shared determination, and the kind of moral authority that could only be earned through suffering for the sake of others. The rescue was complete, but the real fight was just beginning. This time, they would not fight alone. Spring came late to Cedar Falls in 1924. But with it arrived federal investigators whose presence would transform Martha and Marcus's desperate alliance into a force capable of challenging the town's entrenched corruption. Agent Elizabeth Thornton, of the newly created Federal Bureau of Labor Relations, stepped off the morning train from Detroit on April 3rd, carrying a briefcase full of preliminary reports about workplace safety violations in northern Michigan's industrial facilities. Her assignment was to investigate the systematic failures that had led to the Cedar Falls mill fire, but her real mission, unknown to local authorities, was to examine evidence of organized corruption that extended far beyond a single workplace accident. Martha and Marcus had spent the winter months methodically rebuilding their case against the Whitmore family, working from the basement of Father Carter's church, where they'd established an unofficial headquarters for their investigation. The priest had provided them with workspace, basic supplies, and most importantly, protection from the retaliation that would certainly have followed if their activities had been discovered by local authorities. Their collaboration had proven remarkably effective, combining Martha's research skills with Marcus's practical knowledge of industrial operations and safety procedures. Martha had developed a comprehensive timeline of safety violations, documenting not just the specific failures that contributed to the mill fire, but the broader pattern of negligence that characterized the Whitmore family's approach to worker protection. Marcus had used his network of contacts throughout the region's industrial communities to gather testimony from current and former Whitmore employees who were willing to speak honestly about working conditions, safety procedures, and management's response to worker concerns. These testimonies painted a picture of systematic disregard for human life that extended far beyond the single incident that had brought Grace Sullivan near death. But their most important discovery had come through Martha's analysis of financial records that she'd accessed through legitimate research at the county courthouse. Her examination of property transfers, business licenses, and tax assessments had revealed a complex web of financial relationships that explained how the Whitmore family maintained their control over Cedar Falls' economic and political machinery. The family's influence wasn't limited to their direct ownership of the mill. Through a network of shell companies, strategic partnerships, and carefully structured loans, they controlled significant portions of the town's real estate, influenced the operations of supposedly independent businesses, and maintained financial leverage over local government officials who depended on their continued support for their own economic survival. Agent Thornton's arrival provided Martha and Marcus with their first opportunity to present their evidence to someone with the authority and independence necessary to act on their findings. But approaching a federal investigator required careful planning, since local authorities would certainly attempt to discredit any evidence that threatened their arrangement with the Whitmore family. Martha's strategy involved establishing contact through Father Carter, whose reputation for integrity and community service made him an ideal intermediary. The priest arranged a private meeting at the church, presenting it to Agent Thornton as a pastoral consultation about the social impacts of industrial accidents on small communities. Agent Thornton, Father Carter began, when the three conspirators gathered in his private study, I've asked Miss Hayes and Mr. Bennett to join our conversation because they have information that might be relevant to your investigation of workplace safety in our community. Agent Thornton studied Martha and Marcus with the professional assessment of someone trained to distinguish between reliable witnesses and disgruntled troublemakers. Her preliminary briefing had included warnings about local individuals who might attempt to use federal investigators to pursue personal vendettas against employers or community leaders. Father Carter tells me you have concerns about safety procedures at the mill, Agent Thornton said carefully. I'd be interested in hearing your perspectives, but I should mention that I've already spoken with mill management and local authorities about the fire incident. Martha understood that Agent Thornton was testing their credibility, determining whether they would present wild accusations or documented evidence. Her response was measured and professional, establishing her competence while avoiding the emotional appeals that might undermine her credibility. Agent Thornton, we've prepared a comprehensive analysis of safety violations at the Whitmore Mill, including documentation that extends back several years before the fire incident. Our evidence includes official reports, financial records, and witness testimonies that demonstrate a pattern of deliberate negligence rather than isolated oversights. The portfolio that Martha presented to Agent Thornton contained materials that had required months of careful research and analysis. Safety inspection reports that had been falsified, building permits that had been issued despite obvious code violations, insurance claims that had been filed for equipment that was never actually purchased, and financial records that showed safety improvement funds being diverted to other purposes. But the most compelling evidence was the collection of witness statements that Marcus had gathered from workers throughout the region. These testimonies revealed that the Whitmore Mill's safety problems weren't unique. Similar violations existed at other facilities owned or influenced by the family, suggesting a systematic approach to cost-cutting that prioritized profits over human life. Agent Thornton examined their evidence with growing interest and alarm. Her federal authority meant she could investigate matters that local officials might be reluctant to pursue, but it also meant she needed ironclad documentation to support any actions against politically connected families like the Whitmores. "This is impressive work," Agent Thornton acknowledged after reviewing their materials, "but I need to ask why you haven't presented this evidence to local authorities." Sheriff Garrett and the county prosecutor would normally handle investigations of this type. Marcus's response revealed the sophistication of their analysis and their understanding of the local power structure. Agent Thornton, Sheriff Garrett's department, receives significant funding from county commissioners who depend on Whitmore family support for their own political survival. The county prosecutor's law practice includes several clients with business relationships to the mill. Local authorities aren't necessarily corrupt, but they're operating within a system that makes independent investigation of the Whitmore family practically impossible. This explanation resonated with Agent Thornton's own observations during her preliminary meetings with local officials. She'd noticed the careful language they used when discussing the mill fire, their reluctance to examine certain aspects of the incident, and their obvious discomfort when federal oversight was mentioned. The federal investigation that emerged from this collaboration would prove far more comprehensive than anything the Whitmore family had anticipated. Agent Thornton's authority allowed her to subpoena records that local officials couldn't access, interview witnesses who might be intimidated by local pressure, and examine financial relationships that revealed the full scope of the family's influence over Cedar Falls' institutional structure. Martha's role in this expanded investigation involved organizing and analyzing documentary evidence, creating comprehensive timelines that connected individual incidents to broader patterns of negligence, and preparing witness statements for federal review. Her library training proved invaluable in managing the massive amount of information that Agent Thornton's investigation generated. Marcus served as the technical expert who could explain the practical implications of safety violations, assess the adequacy of proposed corrective measures, and evaluate the credibility of testimony from other industrial workers. His reputation among the region's working communities provided Agent Thornton with access to witnesses who might otherwise have been reluctant to cooperate with federal authorities. But their most important contribution was their understanding of the local context that federal investigators might miss. Agent Thornton had experience with industrial safety violations and corporate corruption, but Martha and Marcus understood the specific social and economic dynamics that allowed such corruption to flourish in small communities like Cedar Falls. Their preparation for the expanded federal investigation required developing strategies for protecting witnesses from retaliation, documenting evidence that might be destroyed if local authorities learned about the investigation's scope, and maintaining their own safety while working closely with federal agents who were viewed as threats by the town's power structure. The Whitmore family's response to Agent Thornton's presence revealed both their influence and their vulnerability. They arranged social events to demonstrate their community standing, organized testimonials from local business leaders about their positive economic impact, and mobilized political connections to question the necessity and scope of federal oversight. But These defensive measures also confirmed the validity of Martha and Marcus's accusations. Innocent parties facing federal investigation typically cooperated fully and welcomed opportunities to clear their names. The Whitmore family's elaborate efforts to control and limit the investigation suggested they had significant reasons to fear comprehensive examination of their operations. The investigation's most dramatic breakthrough came when Agent Thornton discovered that similar safety violations existed at Whitmore-affiliated facilities in 3 other states, indicating that the family's disregard for worker welfare represented a deliberate business strategy rather than local mismanagement. This discovery elevated the case from a regional safety investigation to a federal criminal matter involving conspiracy to violate worker protection laws across state boundaries. Martha and Marcus watched these developments with satisfaction tempered by understanding of the costs they'd paid to reach this point. Their reputations in Cedar Falls remained destroyed, their economic prospects remained limited, and their social relationships remained poisoned by the campaign that had been waged against them. But they'd also discovered something more valuable than the respect of people who could be intimidated into silence, or the security of jobs that depended on their willingness to ignore corruption. They discovered the satisfaction that came from using their suffering to protect others, transforming their personal trauma into institutional change that would benefit workers throughout the region. The preparation phase was drawing to a close, as federal investigators assembled evidence for what would become the largest workplace safety prosecution in Michigan's history. Martha and Marcus had evolved from isolated victims to crucial partners in a federal investigation that would expose corruption reaching far beyond Cedar Falls. Their alliance, forged in a church basement during a winter storm, had become a force capable of challenging institutional power and holding wealthy families accountable for their actions. The investigation they'd launched would soon move into its final phase, where the evidence they'd gathered would be tested in federal court. Against some of the best legal talent that money could buy, the preparation was complete. The real battle for justice was about to begin. The federal courthouse in Grand Rapids had never seen anything like the trial that began on September 15, 1924. When the United States government brought criminal charges against the Whitmore family and their network of business associates for conspiracy to violate federal workplace safety laws across multiple states. Martha Hayes sat in the witness section, wearing her best dress, a simple blue garment that Father Carter's parishioners had purchased for her testimony, watching as teams of federal prosecutors arranged evidence that she and Marcus had spent months gathering and documenting. The courtroom buzzed with reporters from Detroit, Chicago, and even New York, drawn by a case that represented the federal government's most ambitious attempt to hold wealthy industrialists accountable for systematic worker endangerment. Marcus Bennett occupied a seat near the front, his massive frame somehow diminished by the formal setting, but his presence commanding respect from everyone who understood his role in exposing the conspiracy. He wore a borrowed suit that barely contained his powerful build, but his dignity was entirely his own, earned through months of suffering for the sake of truth and justice. Federal prosecutor James Whitfield stood to deliver his opening statement, with the confidence of a man who'd built his career on cases that powerful people assumed they were too influential to lose. At 45, Whitfield had successfully prosecuted corrupt politicians, fraudulent businessmen, and industrial executives who believed their wealth and connections made them immune to legal consequences. "Gentlemen of the jury," Whitfield began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "over the next several weeks, you will hear evidence of a conspiracy that spans 4 states and involves millions of dollars in profits earned through the systematic endangerment of American workers. The defendants in this case didn't commit their crimes in dark alleys or abandoned warehouses. They committed them in boardrooms and country clubs, using corporate structures and political connections to hide criminal negligence behind the facade of respectable business practice. The defense table presented a formidable array of legal talent that the Whitmore family had assembled to protect their interests. Lead attorney Harrison Blackwood was considered one of the finest criminal defense lawyers in the Midwest, known for his ability to discredit prosecution witnesses and create reasonable doubt, even in cases with overwhelming evidence. Blackwood's strategy became apparent during his opening statement, which portrayed the Whitmore family as victims of federal overreach and personal vendettas by disgruntled former employees who were using government resources to pursue frivolous complaints against their former employers. Ladies and gentlemen, Blackwood told the jury, the prosecution's case relies entirely on the testimony of individuals who have personal grievances against my clients. Marcus Bennett was fired for insubordination and poor judgment. Martha Hayes lost her position for misusing public resources to pursue personal crusades. These are not credible witnesses. They are bitter individuals seeking revenge through the criminal justice system. But Prosecutor Whitfield had anticipated this line of attack, and his response demonstrated the sophisticated preparation that had characterized the entire federal investigation. Rather than beginning with Martha and Marcus's testimony, he started with documentary evidence that established the scope and systematic nature of the Whitmore family's safety violations. The first week of testimony focused on technical evidence, falsified safety inspection reports, building permits issued despite obvious code violations, financial records showing safety improvement funds diverted to executive compensation, and correspondence between Whitmore executives that revealed their awareness of dangerous conditions at their facilities. Dr. Robert Steinberg, a federal safety expert from Washington, testified about the specific violations that had contributed to the Cedar Falls mill fire, explaining to the jury how each failure to follow established safety procedures had increased the likelihood of catastrophic accidents. His analysis was methodical and devastating, demonstrating that the fire that nearly killed Grace Sullivan was not an unfortunate accident, but the predictable result of deliberate cost-cutting measures. The evidence shows a pattern of decisions that prioritized short-term profits over worker safety. Dr. Steinberg explained, emergency exits were blocked to maximize production floor space. Fire suppression systems were disabled to reduce maintenance costs. Electrical systems were modified by unqualified personnel to avoid the expense of proper upgrades. Each of these violations individually increased fire risk. Combined, they created conditions where a serious fire was virtually inevitable. The prosecution's strategy built methodically toward the presentation of witness testimony that would personalize the technical evidence and demonstrate the human cost of the defendant's actions. But before calling Martha and Marcus to testify, Prosecutor Whitfield presented a series of witnesses whose credibility defense attorney Blackwood would find difficult to challenge. Agent Elizabeth Thornton took the stand on the trial's 8th day, presenting the federal investigation's findings with the professional authority of someone whose career depended on accurate analysis rather than personal vendettas. Her testimony established that the safety violations at Cedar Falls were part of a multi-state pattern that indicated coordinated policy rather than local mismanagement. Our investigation identified similar violations at Whitmore-affiliated facilities. In Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Indiana, Agent Thornton testified, the consistency of these violations across different states and facilities suggests systematic implementation of cost-cutting measures that disregarded federal safety requirements. The impact of Agent Thornton's testimony was amplified by her presentation of communications between Whitmore executives that explicitly discussed the financial benefits of avoiding safety compliance. Internal memoranda revealed conversations about the cost-benefit analysis of paying potential fines versus implementing required safety measures, with executives calculating that occasional penalties were cheaper than comprehensive compliance. When Martha Hayes finally took the witness stand on the trial's 12th day, she faced a hostile cross-examination that attempted to portray her as an unstable individual whose personal disappointments had motivated false accusations against respected community leaders. Defense attorney Blackwood's questioning was aggressive and personal, designed to undermine her credibility by focusing on her employment termination and economic hardships. "Miss Hayes," Blackwood began, "isn't it true that you were fired from your position as town librarian for misusing public resources and engaging in activities that brought disrepute to the institution?" Martha's response demonstrated the composure and intellectual clarity that had characterized her research throughout the investigation. "Mr. Blackwood, I was terminated because my research into public safety violations threatened the economic interests of powerful families who controlled the library board. Every document I accessed was part of the public record. Every copy I made was within my authority as librarian. My termination was retaliation for exposing inconvenient truths, not punishment for professional misconduct." Blackwood continued, his attack attempting to portray Martha's alliance with Marcus as evidence of questionable judgment and possible romantic involvement that might compromise her objectivity. But Martha's responses consistently returned focus to the documented evidence rather than personal motivations. "Mr. Blackwood, my relationship with Mr. Bennett is based on shared commitment to worker safety and government accountability. We became allies because we both witnessed systematic violations of laws designed to protect human life. Our personal friendship developed through our mutual respect for truth and justice, values that should be celebrated rather than questioned." Marcus's testimony proved even more powerful because his credibility as the man who'd risked his life to save Grace. Sullivan was difficult for defense attorneys to challenge. His detailed knowledge of mill operations, combined with his documented efforts to address safety concerns through proper channels, established him as a reliable witness whose motivations were clearly focused on protecting others rather than pursuing personal gain. "Mr. Bennett," Prosecutor Whitfield asked, "why did you continue reporting safety violations after your initial concerns were ignored by mill management?" Marcus's response carried the quiet authority of someone who'd suffered for his principles. "Sir, I knew that ignoring those violations would eventually result in serious injuries or deaths. I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent, and someone got hurt because I was afraid of losing my job. Some things are more important than personal security." Defense attorney Blackwood's cross-examination of Marcus attempted to portray him as a disgruntled employee whose heroics during the mill fire had inflated his sense of importance and authority. But Marcus's responses consistently demonstrated the humility and practical focus that had characterized his approach throughout the investigation. "Mr. Blackwood, I never claimed any special authority or expertise beyond my knowledge of construction and safety procedures. I documented violations because documenting problems is the first step towards solving them. I reported violations because workers deserve to know about dangers in their workplace. I testified in this trial because someone needs to speak for people who can't protect themselves against powerful interests." The trial's dramatic climax came during the testimony of Grace Sullivan, now 13 years old and fully recovered from her injuries in the mill fire. Her presence in the courtroom served as a powerful reminder of the human consequences of the defendant's actions. But her testimony proved even more compelling than her symbolic value. Grace described her experience in the mill basement with remarkable clarity and composure, explaining how she'd been trapped by debris when the fire spread faster than anyone had anticipated. Her account of Marcus's rescue demonstrated not just his physical courage, but his intimate knowledge of the building's layout and structural weaknesses. Mr. Bennett knew exactly where to find me because he'd been in that basement many times, checking on the problems he'd been reporting to management, Grace testified. He told me later that he'd warned them the emergency exits were blocked and the fire equipment wasn't working properly. He said he'd been trying to get those problems fixed for months before the fire happened. But Grace's most powerful testimony came when she described the conversation she'd overheard between her mother and mill supervisor Charles Morton 2 weeks before the fire. Morton had dismissed Rebecca Sullivan's concerns about safety conditions, telling her that workers who complained about minor issues might find themselves replaced by people who were more grateful for employment. He told my mother that some people didn't appreciate how good they had it working for a respected family like the Whitmores, Grace recalled. He said people who made trouble usually ended up regretting it. The prosecution's case concluded with financial evidence that demonstrated the scope of profits the Whitmore family had earned through their systematic avoidance of safety compliance. Expert testimony revealed that proper safety measures would have reduced their annual profits by less than 3%, while the violations had resulted in cost savings that directly benefited executive compensation and shareholder dividends. Third day, defense's case attempted to portray the Whitmore family as victims of overzealous federal regulation and personal vendettas by former employees. Character witnesses praised their community contributions and business success, while technical experts disputed the prosecution's analysis of safety violations and their contribution to the mill fire. But the defense's strategy was fundamentally undermined by the overwhelming documentary evidence that the prosecution had presented. Internal communications between Whitmore executives clearly demonstrated their awareness of safety violations and their calculated decisions to prioritize profits over worker protection. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against all defendants. The speed of their decision reflected not just the strength of the prosecution's evidence, but their revulsion at the systematic endangerment of workers for the sake of minor cost savings. Judge Harrison delivered sentences that reflected the serious nature of the crimes and the need to deter similar conduct by other industrial executives. Harold Whitmore Sr. received 5 years in federal prison and massive fines that would force the family to sell significant business assets. Other defendants received sentences ranging from 2 to 4 years, along with financial penalties that would reshape the region's industrial landscape. But the trial's most significant impact came through the precedent it established for federal prosecution of workplace safety violations and the institutional changes it inspired. The Whitmore case became a model for holding wealthy industrialists accountable for systematic worker endangerment, leading to similar prosecutions throughout the country. As Martha and Marcus left the courthouse after the sentencing hearing, they carried with them the satisfaction of having transformed their personal suffering into institutional change that would protect countless other workers from similar abuse. Their alliance, forged in desperation and sustained through months of systematic persecution, had ultimately proved stronger than the wealth and influence of one of Michigan's most powerful families. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the precedent had been established that no one was too wealthy or influential to escape accountability for crimes against working people. The confrontation was over, but the legacy would endure for generations. The transformation of Cedar Falls began not with grand announcements or dramatic gestures, but with small acts of courage that spread through the community like ripples across still water. 2 years after the federal trial that had sent the Whitmore family to prison, Martha Hayes stood before the newly rebuilt Cedar Falls Public Library, reading the bronze plaque that commemorated its dedication to the pursuit of truth and the protection of community welfare. She had been invited to speak at the dedication ceremony by the new library board, composed entirely of members who had replaced the previous board after their connections to the Whitmore corruption scandal became public knowledge. The invitation represented more than personal vindication for Martha. It symbolized a fundamental shift in how the community understood the relationship between truth, power, and civic responsibility. The woman who had been ostracized and economically destroyed for exposing inconvenient facts was now being honored as a guardian of the very principles that had cost her so dearly. Martha's speech to the gathered crowd was characteristically understated, focusing not on her personal vindication, but on the broader lessons that Cedar Falls had learned through its painful encounter with systematic corruption. She spoke about the importance of institutional independence, the necessity of protecting those who spoke uncomfortable truths, and the community's obligation to ensure that power served justice rather than personal interest. A library is more than a repository of books, Martha told her audience. It's a symbol of our commitment to knowledge over ignorance, truth over convenience, and the belief that information belongs to all citizens rather than just those wealthy enough to control it. The new policies this board has implemented, guaranteeing public access to government records, protecting library staff from political pressure, establishing clear procedures for research and documentation. These policies ensure that what happened to me cannot happen to future librarians who discover inconvenient truths. The audience that applauded Martha's speech included many faces that had once turned away from her in the streets. Some of these people had genuinely changed their understanding of civic responsibility through the community's traumatic encounter with corruption. Others were simply adjusting their public positions to align with the new social consensus that had emerged after the federal trials. But Martha understood that social change was always a mixture of genuine conversion and pragmatic adaptation. What mattered was not the purity of individual motivations, but the institutional structures that would protect future truth-tellers from the kind of systematic persecution that she and Marcus had endured. Marcus Bennett's own transformation had been equally dramatic, though it took a different form than Martha's public rehabilitation. The man who had been fired from his mill job for reporting safety violations now served as the regional director of the newly created Federal Workplace Safety Administration, with responsibility for enforcing the labor protection laws that had emerged from the Whitmore prosecution. His office in the renovated mill building, now operated by a worker-owned cooperative that had purchased the facility from the government after the Whitmore family's assets were liquidated, symbolized the complete reversal of power relationships that the federal intervention had created. The basement, where Grace Sullivan had nearly died, now housed a training center where workers learned to identify safety violations and report them through channels that were protected from employer retaliation. Marcus's approach to his new responsibilities reflected the practical wisdom he'd gained through his own experience with corporate corruption and government indifference. Rather than simply enforcing regulations through punitive measures, he focused on education and prevention, working with employers and workers to create safety cultures that made violations less likely to occur. People generally want to do the right thing, Marcus explained to a group of new safety inspectors during a training session. The problem comes when economic pressures or institutional structures make it easier to ignore safety requirements than to follow them. Our job isn't just to catch violations. It's to change the conditions that create violations in the first place. The cooperative that now operated the former Whitmore mill had implemented safety procedures that exceeded federal requirements, not because they were mandated by law, but because the worker owners understood that their own lives and livelihoods depended on maintaining safe working conditions. The mill's safety record had become a model for similar facilities throughout the region, demonstrating that worker control could be more effective than external regulation in protecting human life. Grace Sullivan, now 15 years old and thriving academically, had become an unofficial symbol of the community's transformation. Her survival of the mill fire and her courageous testimony during the federal trial had inspired a generation of young people who understood that individuals could make a difference when they found the courage to speak truth to power. Grace's own plans reflected the broader changes that had occurred in Cedar Falls. She intended to study law with the goal of becoming a federal prosecutor specializing in workplace safety cases. Her near-death experience had given her a personal understanding of why such work mattered, while her community's response to that experience had shown her the institutional changes that were possible when enough people committed themselves to justice over convenience. The relationship between Martha and Marcus had deepened during the years following the federal trial, evolving from alliance based on shared suffering to partnership based on mutual respect and complementary strengths. Their collaboration on various community improvement projects had revealed compatible approaches to problem-solving and social change that extended far beyond their original fight against the Whitmore family. Martha's intellectual curiosity and research skills had found new outlets in her work documenting the social and economic changes that federal intervention had brought to Cedar Falls. Her comprehensive study of the community's transformation was being published by the University of Michigan Press as a case study in how systematic corruption could be identified, challenged, and replaced with more accountable institutions. Marcus's practical experience and moral authority had made him a sought-after consultant for communities facing similar challenges with corporate corruption and institutional capture. His presentations at conferences throughout the Midwest drew audiences of workers, government officials, and academics who wanted to understand how ordinary people could successfully challenge powerful interests. But their most important collaboration was personal rather than professional. The alliance that had been forged in desperate circumstances had grown into something deeper and more sustaining. A partnership based on shared values, mutual respect, and the kind of love that developed when two people discovered they could trust each other completely. Their relationship had developed slowly and carefully, both understanding that their individual healing from the trauma of systematic persecution required time and patience. Neither wanted to confuse romantic attraction with the intense bond that had formed during their fight for justice, but both gradually recognized that their feelings extended beyond mere alliance or friendship. The moment of recognition came during a quiet evening at Martha's cottage, a small house she'd purchased with her earnings from consulting work with federal agencies investigating similar corruption cases in other communities. They had been reviewing documents related to a new case in Ohio, when Martha looked up to find Marcus watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. "What are you thinking about?" Martha asked, setting aside the papers that had absorbed her attention. Marcus's response revealed the depth of feeling that had been growing between them for months. "I was thinking about how beautiful you are when you're completely focused on something important, not just physically beautiful, though you are that too. Beautiful in the way you care about truth and justice. Beautiful in the way you never give up when something matters. Beautiful in the way you've transformed everything that was done to hurt you into tools for helping other people." Martha felt tears forming as she realized that Marcus was seeing her in ways that no one else ever had, not as the damaged librarian who'd lost her job for being inconveniently honest, but as someone whose intelligence, courage, and compassion made her genuinely beautiful, despite the scars that their enemies had tried to leave on her spirit. "Marcus," she said softly, when the town whispered that I was too scarred from everything that happened to us, too damaged to be worthy of respect or friendship, you were the only person who saw something different. You saw strength where others saw weakness, beauty where others saw damage, hope where others saw defeat. Their first kiss happened naturally, without dramatic declarations or orchestrated romance. It was simply the recognition of what had been growing between them for months, the acknowledgement that their partnership had become something deeper and more permanent than either had originally imagined. The wedding that took place 6 months later was attended by an unlikely collection of guests that reflected the community's transformation. Federal agents sat next to former mill workers. Government officials shared tables with labor organizers. Grace Sullivan served as Martha's maid of honor, while Father Carter performed the ceremony in the same church basement where Martha and Marcus had first discovered their ability to support each other. The vows they exchanged were written by themselves, reflecting their shared understanding of what marriage meant to people who had learned to trust each other completely through the crucible of shared suffering and mutual support. I promise to tell you the truth, even when it's difficult, Martha pledged. I promise to stand with you against whatever challenges we face together. I promise to see you as you truly are, not as others might want to define you. Marcus's response carried the same weight of lived experience. I promise to protect what matters to both of us. I promise to see your strength even when you feel weak, your beauty even when others try to convince you it doesn't exist, your worth even when the world tries to make you forget it. Their honeymoon was spent in Washington, D.C., where they testified before congressional committees that were considering legislation to strengthen federal oversight of workplace safety and protect whistleblowers from employer retaliation. The bills that emerged from these hearings, known collectively as the Bennett-Hayes Worker Protection Act, established legal frameworks that would prevent future cases like theirs from requiring such extreme personal sacrifice. The legacy of their struggle extended far beyond their personal happiness or professional success. The precedent established by the Whitmore prosecution had inspired similar federal investigations in dozens of other communities, leading to a nationwide campaign against industrial corruption that fundamentally changed the relationship between workers, employers, and government regulators. More importantly, their story had become a template for how ordinary people could successfully challenge systematic injustice through careful documentation, strategic alliance building, and persistent commitment to truth despite personal costs. Universities throughout the country were teaching courses based on their methods, training new generations of advocates in the techniques they had pioneered. The transformation of Cedar Falls from a company town controlled by a single powerful family to a community governed by accountable institutions and democratic participation demonstrated that fundamental change was possible even in places where corruption had become entrenched over generations. As Martha and Marcus settled into their new life together, they carried with them the knowledge that their individual suffering had been transformed into collective progress. Their personal trauma had become institutional wisdom, and their love for each other had grown from the shared commitment to principles larger than themselves. The legacy was secure, but the work continued. Each new case of corruption they helped expose, each worker they helped protect, each community they assisted in building more accountable institutions. All of this represented the ongoing multiplication of their original decision to stand for truth despite overwhelming opposition. Their story had become larger than their individual lives, inspiring countless others to find the courage to speak truth to power, and to believe that justice was possible even when it seemed impossibly difficult to achieve. 25 years after the mill fire that changed everything, Martha Bennett stood in the memorial garden that had been built on the site of the original Whitmore textile facility, watching her daughter Sarah place flowers on the monument dedicated to workers who had died in industrial accidents throughout Michigan's history. The autumn wind carried the scent of burning leaves and distant wood smoke, reminders of controlled fires that served human purposes rather than destroying human lives. Martha pulled her wool coat closer around her shoulders, feeling the weight of decades in her bones, but finding strength in the knowledge that time had vindicated every sacrifice she and Marcus had made. Sarah Bennett Morrison, now a federal judge, specializing in labor law cases, had inherited her mother's intellectual curiosity and her father's unwavering commitment to justice. At 32, she represented the second generation of advocates who had grown up understanding that individual courage could create institutional change, that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they found the moral strength to use it. Her own children, ages 7 and 9, played quietly among the Memorial Garden's pathways, unconsciously absorbing lessons about dignity, sacrifice, and the ongoing struggle for justice. The Memorial Garden itself embodied the transformation that Martha and Marcus had helped bring to Cedar Falls. Where smokestacks had once belched toxic fumes into the sky, native wildflowers now bloomed in carefully tended beds that changed with the seasons. Where dangerous machinery had operated without adequate safety protection, children played on equipment designed with meticulous attention to every possible hazard. Where workers had once labored in fear of speaking truth about dangerous conditions, young people now gathered for summer programs that taught them to recognize their rights and responsibilities as future members of the workforce. Tess Garden's centerpiece was a bronze statue depicting a man carrying a child to safety, with a woman standing beside them holding a book and a scroll. The inscription read simply, "To those who speak truth in dangerous times, and to those who listen when truth is spoken." Visitors often assumed the figures represented specific historical characters, but Martha and Marcus had insisted on generic representations that could honor all who found courage in moments of crisis. Martha's reflection on the quarter-century that had passed since her confrontation with the Whitmore family was interrupted by the arrival of Grace Sullivan Chen. Now, Dr. Grace Sullivan Chen, whose medical practice specialized in treating industrial injuries and occupational diseases. Grace's survival of the mill fire had inspired her to dedicate her life to healing others who had been harmed by workplace negligence, creating a career that served as ongoing testimony to the value of the life that Marcus Bennett had risked. Everything to save. Grace approached with the confident stride of someone who had transformed childhood trauma into professional purpose, her medical bag in one hand and a folder of research papers in the other. At 37, she had become one of the nation's leading experts on occupational health, her work cited in congressional hearings and international conferences on worker safety. "Mrs. Bennett," Grace said, embracing Martha with the warmth of someone whose life had been fundamentally shaped by the older woman's courage, "I wanted to thank you again for agreeing to speak at next month's conference. The new generation of workplace safety advocates needs to hear your story directly from you, especially now when some politicians are talking about rolling back the protections you and Mr. Marcus fought so hard to establish." The conference Grace referenced was the annual gathering of the Bennett Hayes Institute for Worker Protection, an organization that had grown from Martha and Marcus's individual advocacy into a national network of researchers, activists, and policymakers who worked to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had once characterized industrial relations throughout the country. The Institute now operated programs in 37 states, maintained a research budget of $12 million annually, and had influenced labor protection policies in 14 countries. Martha's reluctance to continue public speaking at her age reflected not false modesty, but genuine uncertainty about whether her experiences remained relevant to young advocates who had grown up in a world where federal protection of worker rights was an established fact rather than a radical dream. The legal frameworks that she and Marcus had helped create were now so thoroughly integrated into American law that many people assumed they had always existed. "Grace," Martha replied, adjusting her position on the Memorial Garden's stone bench, "I sometimes wonder if our story has become too historical, too removed from current struggles to provide useful guidance. The young people at these conferences are facing challenges we never imagined. Global supply chains that make accountability difficult to establish, technology that creates new forms of workplace surveillance and control, economic pressures that make traditional organizing strategies less effective." Grace's response revealed the sophisticated understanding that had made her one of the country's leading experts on occupational health. "Mrs. Bennett, the specific challenges change, but the fundamental dynamics remain the same. Workers still need protection from employers who prioritize profits over human welfare. Communities still need institutions that can hold powerful interests accountable for their actions. Individuals still need examples of how ordinary people can successfully challenge systematic injustice." She opened her research folder and showed Martha statistics that painted a sobering picture of ongoing workplace dangers. "Last year alone, we documented over 4,000 preventable workplace injuries in Michigan. Companies are using technology to monitor workers more closely than ever, but they're also finding new ways to avoid responsibility for worker safety. Your story isn't historical, Mrs. Bennett. It's a blueprint for the fights we're still having to fight." Their conversation was joined by Thomas Patterson, the former half-wit boy whom Marcus had treated with dignity when the rest of Cedar Falls had dismissed him as worthless. Thomas had grown into a skilled craftsman whose furniture-making business employed 12 people and had become a model of workplace democracy and worker ownership. His transformation from social outcast to respected community leader embodied the broader changes that had occurred when Cedar Falls learned to value people based on their character rather than their social standing. "Mrs. Bennett," Thomas said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to trust his own worth despite early experiences of social rejection, "I've been thinking about what made Mr. Marcus different from other people when I was growing up. He saw something in people that they couldn't always see in themselves. He treated everyone like they had value, even when society said they didn't matter." Thomas's furniture business had become more than a commercial enterprise. It served as a training ground for young people who had been written off by the conventional education system. His workshops taught not just woodworking skills, but lessons about dignity, collaboration, and the possibility of creating economic systems that served human needs rather than exploiting human weakness. Martha understood that Thomas was articulating something profound about Marcus's character and its ongoing influence on the community. Her husband had possessed an unusual ability to recognize human worth regardless of social status, physical appearance, or economic circumstances. This quality had made him a natural ally for people whom society had discarded or overlooked, creating networks of mutual support that had proven crucial during their fight against the Whitmore family's corruption. "Thomas," Martha replied, watching her grandchildren chase fallen leaves across the Memorial Garden's pathways, "Marcus always said that real strength came from protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. And real beauty came from the courage to do what was right regardless of the personal cost. He saw those qualities in people before they saw them in themselves." The memorial garden gradually filled with other visitors as the afternoon progressed, creating an informal gathering of people whose lives had been touched by the events that had begun with a mill fire in 1923. The diversity of this group reflected the broad social changes that had emerged from Martha and Marcus's initial struggle against corruption and injustice. Former mill workers mingled with federal officials who had implemented the safety regulations that grew out of the Whitmore prosecution. Labor organizers shared stories with business owners who had learned to see worker protection as essential to long-term success rather than an obstacle to profitability. Children who had grown up hearing stories about the heroes who had transformed their community played alongside grandparents who remembered when challenging authority meant risking everything. Rebecca Sullivan O'Brien, Grace's mother, arrived, carrying a basket of homemade bread for the informal gathering that had developed around the memorial. Now 68 and a grandmother of 5, Rebecca had spent her later years working with immigrant families who faced language barriers and legal challenges in advocating for workplace safety. Her own experience as a working mother whose child had nearly died due to corporate negligence had given her unique insights into the vulnerabilities that predatory employers exploited. "Martha," Rebecca said, settling beside her old friend on the stone bench, "I wanted you to know that the community center is planning a special exhibition for next year's anniversary. We've been collecting oral histories from everyone who lived through the Whitmore years, trying to preserve the lessons for future generations." The community center Rebecca referenced had been built with funds from the Whitmore family's liquidated assets, transformed from instruments of oppression into tools for education and empowerment. The building housed a library specializing in labor history, meeting rooms available to union organizers and worker advocacy groups, and a childcare center that allowed working parents to attend evening meetings and training sessions. But the gathering's most significant aspect was its inclusion of people who represented ongoing struggles for justice and accountability. Young immigrants who worked in food processing plants where safety violations still occurred. Service workers who faced retaliation for attempting to organize unions. Environmental activists who were challenging corporate polluters who endangered entire communities. Martha found herself in conversation with Maria Rodriguez, a 28-year-old organizer, who was leading efforts to improve working conditions in the region's agricultural sector. Maria's experiences with employer intimidation and government indifference echoed themes that Martha recognized from her own struggles decades earlier. But her strategies reflected innovations that the younger generation had developed to address contemporary challenges. Mrs. Bennett, Maria explained, pulling out her smartphone to show documentation she was gathering. "We're facing the same basic problems you and your husband confronted, just in different industries and with different tactics. Farm workers are still being exposed to dangerous pesticides without proper protection. Companies are still prioritizing profits over human health. Government agencies are still reluctant to challenge powerful agricultural interests." Maria's phone contained videos, photographs, and audio recordings that documented safety violations with a precision that Martha and Marcus could never have achieved with 1920s technology. But the young organizers' challenges also included new obstacles: social media campaigns designed to discredit worker advocates, legal strategies that exploited immigration status to silence witnesses, and economic pressures that made traditional organizing approaches less effective. Martha's response drew from 25 years of experience in advocacy and social change. Maria, the most important lesson we learned was that lasting change requires building institutions that can outlast individual heroes or villains. Personal courage is essential, but it needs to be channeled into systematic reforms that make it easier for the next generation to continue the work. She gestured toward the Memorial Gardens pathways, where people of different ages and backgrounds were sharing stories and strategies for ongoing struggles. Look around you. This gathering happened spontaneously because people understood that they shared common interests despite their different specific challenges. That's how movements grow, not through single dramatic confrontations, but through networks of mutual support that survive temporary defeats and build toward long-term victories. Their conversation was overheard by several other attendees, leading to an impromptu discussion about the evolution of worker protection strategies and the ongoing relevance of the methods that Martha and Marcus had pioneered. The discussion revealed both the progress that had been made and the challenges that remained in creating truly accountable economic institutions. Dr. Rebecca Steinberg, daughter of the federal safety expert who had testified in the Whitmore trial, contributed technical perspectives on how workplace hazards had evolved with technological change. The fundamental principle remains the same, she explained to the gathered group. Workers have the right to know about dangers in their workplace and the right to protection from those dangers. But implementing those rights requires constant vigilance and adaptation as new technologies create new risks. Rebecca's own research focused on emerging challenges like repetitive stress injuries from computer work, chemical exposures in modern manufacturing processes, and psychological harm from surveillance technologies that monitored workers' every movement. Her work demonstrated that the battle for workplace safety was ongoing rather than completed, requiring each generation to adapt proven principles to contemporary threats. The conversation continued as evening approached, and the Memorial Gardens lighting system illuminated the monuments and pathways. The gathering had evolved into something larger than a casual meeting of friends. It had become an informal symposium on the past, present, and future of social justice advocacy. Young activists asked detailed questions about strategic planning, coalition building, and sustainable organizing approaches. Business owners sought advice about creating workplace cultures that prioritized safety without sacrificing productivity. Government officials explored ways to strengthen enforcement of existing regulations while developing new frameworks for emerging challenges. Marcus Bennett, now 78 years old, but still imposing in his presence and moral authority, arrived as the discussion was reaching its most intense phase. His entrance was greeted with the respectful attention that his reputation commanded, but also with the warmth that his character had earned through decades of consistent service to community welfare. Marcus moved more slowly than he had in his younger years, relying on a walking stick that Thomas Patterson had crafted from local oak wood. The scars on his face had deepened with age, but his eyes retained the clarity and compassion that had first attracted Martha's attention during their shared struggles against the Whitmore family's corruption. "I see you're all solving the world's problems without me," Marcus observed, with the gentle humor that had helped him maintain perspective through years of struggle and success. Martha's response reflected the deep partnership that had sustained their marriage through 25 years of shared advocacy. "We were just discussing how the problems keep evolving while the solutions remain surprisingly consistent. Individual courage, institutional accountability, and the recognition that everyone's welfare depends on everyone else's protection." Marcus's contribution to the discussion drew from his continuing work with the Federal Workplace Safety Administration and his observations of how social change occurred across different communities and industries. Despite his official retirement 5 years earlier, he remained active as a consultant and trainer, helping new generations of safety inspectors understand the practical and ethical dimensions of their work. "The most important thing we learned," he told the gathered group, settling carefully onto a stone bench beside Martha, "was that sustainable progress requires changing not just laws and regulations, but the culture that makes those laws necessary. People need to understand that protecting workers isn't just good policy. It's good business and good citizenship. His words carried particular weight because his own career had demonstrated the practical benefits of comprehensive safety programs. The facilities he had helped design and implement had consistently outperformed industry averages in productivity, worker satisfaction, and profitability, proving that safety and success were complementary rather than competing values. As the discussion continued, Martha found herself reflecting on the personal journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened librarian who had discovered evidence of corporate corruption had evolved into someone whose name was associated with federal legislation, university research programs, and international conferences on worker rights. But her most meaningful transformation had been personal rather than professional. The woman who had once believed herself too damaged by conflict and controversy to deserve love had discovered a partnership that had grown stronger through shared struggle and mutual support. Her marriage to Marcus had proved that beauty truly did emerge from character rather than appearance, from courage rather than convenience. The evening's formal conclusion came when Sarah Bennett Morrison asked her parents to share their reflections on the legacy they had created and the lessons they hoped future advocates would remember. Their responses, recorded by several attendees who were documenting the informal oral history session, would later be preserved in the archives of the Bennett Hayes Institute. Martha spoke first, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned through experience that individual actions could have consequences far beyond their original scope. We never set out to become heroes or to create institutions that would outlast our own lives. We simply refused to accept that powerful people could endanger innocent lives without consequences. That refusal led to everything else: the investigations, the trials, the legal changes, the social transformation. She paused to watch her grandchildren, playing with other children in the memorial garden's soft lighting, understanding that their carefree laughter was possible because previous generations had fought battles that these young people would never have to face. But I want to emphasize that our story wasn't just about challenging corruption or changing laws, Martha continued. It was about discovering that ordinary people possess extraordinary capacity for growth, for courage, for love that transcends the wounds that life inflicts on all of us. Marcus saw beauty in me when I felt permanently scarred by everything we'd endured. I learned to see strength in myself that I'd never known existed. Marcus's reflection focused on the collaborative dimensions of their story and its ongoing relevance. Martha and I became more effective together than either of us could have been separately, not just because we combined different skills, but because we gave each other the courage to continue when the costs of integrity seemed unbearable. That partnership became the model for everything else we accomplished. The understanding that lasting change requires building relationships based on shared values rather than personal advantage. He gestured toward the diverse group that had gathered around them, representing multiple generations and various ongoing struggles for justice. Every person here represents a different aspect of the work that still needs to be done. None of you will face exactly the same challenges Martha and I encountered, but all of you will face the same fundamental choice: whether to accept injustice because challenging it is difficult and dangerous, or to risk something valuable for the sake of principles larger than personal comfort. Their final words to the gathering emphasized the ongoing nature of the work they had begun, the institutions we helped create, the laws, the oversight agencies, the advocacy organizations. These are tools that each generation must learn to use effectively, But tools alone don't create change. Change comes from people who understand that their individual welfare is connected to everyone else's welfare, who find the courage to act on that understanding despite personal costs. As the memorial garden gathering dispersed and people returned to their homes throughout Cedar Falls and the surrounding region, Martha and Marcus walked slowly through the paths where wildflowers bloomed on soil that had once been saturated with industrial pollution. Their quiet conversation touched on personal memories, ongoing concerns about social justice, and plans for the limited time they had remaining together. "Do you think we made enough of a difference?" Martha asked, echoing the question that had occurred to her regularly throughout their years of advocacy. Marcus's response carried the peace of someone who had lived according to his deepest convictions. "We made the difference we could make with the opportunities we were given. Other people will make different differences with different opportunities. That's how progress works, each generation building on what came before, adapting old principles to new challenges." They paused beside the bronze statue that anchored the memorial garden, reading again the inscription that had become Cedar Falls' unofficial motto: "To those who speak truth in dangerous times, and to those who listen when truth is spoken." "You know what I think our real legacy is?" Martha said, taking Marcus's hand as they stood beneath the autumn stars. "It's not the laws or the institutions or even the lives we helped save. It's the proof we provided that love can grow stronger through shared struggle, that beauty emerges from character rather than appearance, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they find the courage to support each other completely." Marcus squeezed her hand gently, understanding that their story had become larger than their individual lives, inspiring countless others to find courage in moments of crisis and hope in circumstances that seemed hopeless. The gentle giant had seen beauty where others saw only scars, and together they had transformed their community's understanding of what true beauty actually meant. Their light would continue to shine through all the lives they had touched and all the changes they had inspired, proving that some flames can never be extinguished by those who prefer darkness to truth. As they walked home through streets that had once rejected them but now honored their memory, Martha and Marcus carried with them the knowledge that their love story had become a testament to the transformative power of courage, compassion, and unwavering commitment to justice. In a world where power often seemed immune to accountability and injustice appeared inevitable, their example offered proof that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capacity for creating positive change when they found the moral strength to use it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.